resources. But you may see some minor proposals to retrieve part of the broadcast spectrum. Anyway, I don't want to get caught up in strategies for reallocating the spectrum or alternative means of satisfying the localism. My primary interest here is in identifying the ideology of localism itself. How does it happen that this idea of localism combined with that of free television has gained such a powerful hold on the regulatory imagination and kept it intact all this time? One obvious suggestion would be to say, well, this is a result of broadcasters' interest group lobbying power. And without question, broadcasters are a formidable interest group and a formidable lobbying powers. But there are interest groups on the other side as well, including the entire mobile wireless community. It's comprised of some of the largest companies on the planet. So unless you can come up with a theory about how one interest group triumphs over another, I don't think we're going to make much inroads on this problem with interest group theory. In any case, I don't think we can make much inroads in it without taking into account the power of ideological commitments. Localism isn't just about interest. It's about the power of a political symbol, a political idea, a political ideal. And it's an idea that is just too powerful, I think, to be dislodged except by some equally potent alternative symbol or idea. And unfortunately, a benefit-cost analysis cannot deliver that alternative, competing, potent ideal. The appeal, I don't want to disparage the ideal of localism at some level of philosophical principle. It's not hard to understand the allure of localism. It resonates with our social ideals of community, etc. And that suggests that we should have a system of communications that is designed to empower local voices, resonates with local community tastes and interests, etc. To some people, it is deeply upsetting that our program choices are dictated by the network nabobs in New York or the studio moguls in Hollywood. Some people at the FCC are upset by that idea. But this is really more about symbols than reality, I think. The reality is that when people are left to their own devices, what they watch is that same old programming dictated by network nabobs or Hollywood moguls. Over the years, the FCC has expressed great distress about the influence that major television networks exercise over program choices. There's a long history of efforts to control that network control, to limit that network control. The results of these regulations have been largely negligible. The negligible results are largely, I think, a reflection of the economic reality that local stations simply cannot provide a comparable product of their own. They do not have the audience to generate the advertising revenues that can support programming that is competitive in quality to that provided on a national basis. As bad as network programming can be, and sometimes it seems like there's a four-way race to the bottom, it is almost unfailingly better in quality than the typical local program fare. I've suggested that the cost of localism prompts the question whether what we get in program results is worth the opportunity cost, but that, of course, prompts two other questions, namely, exactly what are we getting in the way of local programming, and what could the FCC do to give us more of it if we need it? The answer to the first question is actually quite simple. It's an answer that comes directly from the FCC. Not as much as we want, not as much as we, the FCC, want. That's the message that comes out of a new rulemaking proposal that is pending right now about localism. The answer to the second question is a little bit more difficult. It doesn't come from the FCC, which has never admitted that it doesn't have the power to regulate more local programming. But the history, I think, suggests that the answer has to be it cannot do so. In the 1970s, an institute, rather elaborate scheme called the ascertainment process, which was seen as a means of forcing local broadcasters to ascertain local needs and interests, and then produce programming responsive to that. That ascertainment process was abandoned in the 1980s, basically as too costly, unnecessary, and basically ineffectual. Currently, stations are required to report on required to have a list of programs that are responsive to local needs, but there's no real formal commission scrutiny and no formal commission enforcement. Current rulemaking I mentioned a moment ago seems to be suggesting a return to the old ascertainment days, although the FCC somewhat disingenuously, I think, denies that it wants to reinstate the old ascertainment rules. But among other things, for example, it is now being proposed that local stations would have to consult with a formally established community advisory board to tell them what local needs were. That would be coupled with renewal application guidelines designed to force stations to provide certain minimal standards for locally oriented programming. Deja vu. What does the Commission expect to achieve this time around that it couldn't achieve back in the 70s? Well, the lesson of the past seems to me to suggest that local stations will not make deep sacrifices in their profit margins to air programs its audiences don't want, or at least don't ask for, simply in order to satisfy regulatory expectations. And certainly I think the lesson suggests that making stations jump through a lot of formalistic hoops like ascertainment or community advisory boards, communing with community leaders, etc., is not likely to work any significant change. Perhaps the FCC in its heart of hearts knows this. It might simply be trying to send a political signal to Congress and the public that it is sort of on the job. Well, but that wouldn't be unknown in the history of regulatory agencies. All of them do it at some point. Again, however, I wouldn't discount the possibility that what's going on here is a bit of cognitive dissonance. The FCC has invested so long and so deeply in this ideal of localism that it simply can't bring itself to admit that its intellectual investment has been a waste of time and effort. So it keeps digging around, hoping to retrieve something from that investment. There's got to be a pony in there somewhere. The main lesson I draw from the localism story, well, it's the big idea is the power of an abstract but entrenched idea, even when it's demonstrably unconnected with tangible measurable social benefits. Indeed, even when it involves large economic and social costs, which I've tried to suggest it does. The fact of the matter is the idea has become a fixture of regulatory policy so deeply entrenched that almost no one dares challenge it. There are proposals, as I said, for making minor changes in the table of allotments, and there's some room for doing that. The FCC itself has suggested some such tweaks. They're all sensible ideas, as far as I can tell. What is noteworthy to me is the fact that almost nobody at least that I've heard, other than a few radical academics and kids out there, has suggested this emperor is naked. Nobody's come forward and said, look, we've just got to get beyond spectrum-based television. And maybe we've got to get beyond localism too. But certainly spectrum-based television as a means of localism, we've got to get beyond that. Nobody's saying that. William James once wrote that ideas should be tested pragmatically according to their cash value in experiential terms. He didn't mean that quite so clumsily as you might think of it, a cash value, but that's one way of thinking about it here, because this idea actually can be cashed out in some respects. I said before that the idea of localism has flunked that test in turn, but it has endured nevertheless. The lesson, or one of the lessons from story one is that regulatory paradigms and ideas don't last forever. So maybe there's some hope here that this one will fade along with the natural monopoly paradigm. Unfortunately, the history is not encouraging. Indeed, the one takeaway from the recent current pending rulemaking on localism, quite the opposite conclusion. So what would it take to change this paradigm? Max Planck once wrote in his autobiography that paradigms sometimes only change when the people who adhere to them die, and a new group of non-believers grows up, knowing not chosen for. Well, that's possible. That's possible that could happen. This one actually has survived several generations, however. It doesn't seem to be nearing giving up the ghost. It's almost become a little bit more like what historian of science Richard Dawkins called a meme. A meme is Dawkins' phrase for an idea that is sort of genetically implanted, so to speak. It just survives generation after generation, kind of passed on like a gene. And so maybe this idea, that's what this is, not a paradigm, but a meme. In which case, of course, we have to change the entire FCC's genome in order to get rid of it. Well, okay, it's time to wrap it up. I began this lecture by saying that after a century, it's time to take stock, see what we've learned. I then proceeded to relate some stories that might provide, in President Obama's phrase, teachable moments. It turns out that these teachable moments teach mostly lessons that are negative. I didn't actually start out thinking, let me dig up all the negative stories that I tell. It just happened that stories that came to my mind immediately as salient stories that sort of illustrated something interesting about the first century of regulation turned out to have, at least in my time, a somewhat negative cast. To not end on such a negative tone, let me suggest, however, a more affirmative lesson, a meta lesson maybe. If you take a comparative survey of where the United States has been over this century of regulation, you compare what we've enjoyed in the way of electronic communication services to what has been enjoyed around the planet, you'd have to say we look pretty good. Over all these 100 years, the FCC, the United States has been ahead. It's true there's a lot of disappointment now in the rather lackluster performance of our deployment of mature broadband services. But even taking that into account, I think you'd have to say that we are not seriously behind the rest of the world in terms of electronic communications overall. So one might think that that would be a kind of affirmative lesson about regulation. Maybe the FCC's regulation isn't so bad after all. Before you rush to that conclusion, however, let me remind you of a remark by Oliver Bismarck, who said, "God protects fools, drunks, and the United States of America," which suggests a somewhat different lesson, which is that with God's help, we don't need the FCCs. Thank you for listening.
We have time for a few questions. Glenn Welling?
Yes, very well. Thank you.
Please identify yourself for the recording.